Hey everybody, it's Frozen with Outdoor Adventures, and thanks for joining me on this very windy fall day. It's absolutely beautiful out here and it feels great. Today I'm going to continue the beginner hammocking discussion and talk about tarps. Now, just before we get started, there are so many ways to do tarps. So many ways to attach your tarp to a tree, down to a tent stake, to hang your tarp, different materials. I can't possibly hope to cover every single topic. So we're going to go into the basics, what you need to know, and a few things to get you started. First off, a tarp is meant to shield you from not only the rain, but other weather like snow, wind, and condensation. A tarp may be one of the most expensive pieces you're going to purchase for your hammock system, or it may not be. It just depends really on what kind of features you're looking for in a tarp and what materials you're looking for in a tarp. Speaking of materials, let's just run down the list right now. First up, we have a nylon material. Nylon is going to be the cheaper of the fabrics that I'm about to talk to you about today, and it's also going to be a little bit heavy and not as waterproof over time compared to something like this tarp behind me, which is a sil nylon tarp. As far as nylon tarps, these could range anywhere from, I've seen them as low as 20 bucks depending on the size that you're looking for, all the way up to, $120. It just depends again on the features that you're looking for. With nylon tarps, they have great puncture resistance, which is something you might want to think about because let's face it, we're camping under trees here, and it very well could happen that a branch or a small limb comes down and punctures your tarp. With nylon, usually it's made of a ripstop nylon, so there's a grid pattern in the tarp. Meaning, once the tarp gets punctured, that's all there is to it. It won't continue to tear like a piece of paper. If you've ever, stuck your finger through a piece of paper, it just continues to tear. With nylon tarps, they are usually PU coated, which is a way to waterproof them. Now, after a while, this PU coating actually wears off and you have to basically wash your tarp with some kind of technical wash. Now I have a whole video about washing a rain jacket. It's pretty much the same process. If you want to check out that video, it's right up there in the suggested cards. Let's talk about sil nylon, which is one of the tarps that I have behind me. Sil nylon is basically the same nylon tarp, but it's impregnated in the middle with silicone, making it completely waterproof, meaning you never have to add the waterproofing back to the tarp. It's tear resistant. If you get a puncture in it, it's not going to continue to tear. Again, that paper analogy that I said toward the beginning of the video. As far as sil nylon tarps, the price is reasonable. The protection is great depending on the features that you get. The only downside with sil nylon is when it rains and your tarp gets wet, it has a tendency to absorb some water. It won't rain inside your hammock, mind you, but it will absorb some water and you will have to dry out your tarp. On top of that, when your tarp gets wet, it tends to sag. And that's really the only downside about sil nylon tarps. Now there is another material that is very similar called sil poly. You guessed it, it's polyester infused with a silicone membrane. A sil poly tarp does have the same kind of waterproofness as a sil nylon tarp. However, it does not sag when it gets wet. Now there is still a downside when it comes to sil poly. It is a little more, it's puncture resistant, but if it gets a puncture, it tends to just keep ripping. So that's something that you're gonna have to look out for. As far as the weight, they're very similar, sil nylon, sil poly, pretty similar in the weight ratings, very, very similar in their waterproofness, in their look, in their feel. Now there is one more material that we're gonna talk about today. It's called Dyneema Composite Fabric, or DCF. You may also have heard of this material referred to as Cuban fiber. Let's get into the background history on this tarp because I think there's a lot to learn about it. A lot of people don't understand and there's some misconceptions about it. So Dyneema Composite Fabric, formerly Cuban fiber, was made by a company called Cubic Tech. Originally, Cuban fiber was designed for making sails for sailboats. Very, very waterproof material. It doesn't absorb any water whatsoever, and it's very, very strong. I think a lot of people tend to think that this, in fact, I have a little piece of Cuban fiber to show you right here. A lot of people tend to think that this is not a strong fabric. It's incredibly strong. It's also very, very puncture and rip resistant. Let me show you right now. A lot of people think that, you know, once this stuff punctures, I mean, this stuff is incredibly light. That's the big draw to this. It's also waterproof. So I have a tent stake, I have some Cuben fiber or Dyneema composite fabric. We're just gonna punch a hole in this stuff. Okay, so you can see we have the tent stake in the Cuben fiber. Now I'm gonna try to rip it. Now it's gonna give me a really hard time, because if you can take a look at it, you see these really light fibers that are running throughout the tarp. So that makes it incredibly tear resistant. Okay, I put almost all of my force on there, and you can see the Dyneema composite fabric, the fibers in there, which is what I'm talking about. And then it's just laminated. So Dyneema composite fabric is a great choice for a tarp. Sounds too good to be true. It kind of is. The big downside of Cuben fiber is that it is very, very, very expensive. We're talking about in the range of $230 all the way up to, I've seen it as $400, depending on the size and again, the features that you want in your tarp. Now, I do have a Cuben fiber tarp. We're gonna take a look at it right now. This is my DCF tarp, my Dyneema composite fabric Cuben fiber tarp. It has lasted me about 2 years now, probably going on 3, and it is super strong, super durable, very, very wind resistant, and completely waterproof. It doesn't absorb any water whatsoever. And whenever it rains, you simply just wipe the water off, and you don't have that extra water weight as you do with sil poly or sil nylon or even nylon tarps. This may be out of your budget range, which coming from a beginner backpacking series like this, I can completely understand that. So my suggestion to you is stick with sil nylon or sil poly. It's a good middle of the road material, and it's not as heavy as nylon. You don't have to worry about, you know, redoing the durable water repellent or the PU coating on it. So let's talk about how I attach my tarps to the tree. I think that's the biggest thing here. So if you remember the overhand knot, what I'm doing is I'm just making the overhand knot. If you haven't seen the knot video, be sure to check right up there in the suggested videos and learn those knots before watching this one, before proceeding. I think every hammock camper should know a series of knots just to make your life a lot easier. Now, we're also gonna get into Dutchware gear while we're talking about our tarps. We're just gonna take a look at this right after we get into the knot tying. So again, I have a overhand knot right here. It's wound around the tree and then coming back through itself. Down here, it goes to the D-ring or O-ring, whatever you wanna call it. Most tarps have these little connectors to attach lines to your tarp. And then it comes back, and this is where I put my taut line hitch. This allows me to tighten or loosen the tarp as needed, and it works out really well. And I also have that on that blue cord down there. Now I have paracord on here. I do not suggest using paracord. The line that I really recommend is called Zing It, which is this line right here. Really high braking strength, very, very light, and it just works so much better than paracord for literally every application that you're gonna do with a hammock. So stay away from paracord. I'm just using it as kind of like a visual aid so you can see it a lot better. So coming down to the bottom of the tarp, this is how I tie my tarp to the tent stake, essentially, to the guy line. All it is, again, it's just an overhand knot. Check out that knot video if you don't know what I'm talking about. And it is run through itself. And we're gonna take a look at exactly how to do this in just a second here. Then it comes all the way down to the tent stake, and I have a marlin spike hitch in it. I'm using the tent stake as my toggle. So let's take a look at how I did that. Okay, so here's my line. I have an overhand knot right here, and then it's just a full length of rope, okay, with no end on it. So what I do is I take the D-ring, put the overhand knot loop through the D-ring, and then take the line and put it through the overhand loop and pull it through. This essentially attaches your line to your tarp, and it's not gonna go anywhere, as you can see. Now the cool thing about this knot and why I use this knot is because I can easily detach my line from the D-ring to pack it up, or if I just want to keep it on there, I can do that as well. As far as attaching the line to the tent stake, all we're going to do is we're going to choose a point on the line, make a marlin spike hitch. See, we have that hole right there. Slide the tent stake in there and then lock it down. From here, we can then put it into the ground. And that's not going anywhere. Wind can blow all at once and that will stay secure. Now, something I want to talk to you about is Dutchware gear. Dutchware gear is a company that's been around for a while. Used to be a Cottage vendor, but he's getting really, really big and has several employees under him now. But this is just an example of some Dutchware. Dutchware is meant to take the knot tying out of your hammock setup. So what you're looking at right now is a Dutchware wasp, and I'll show you how to do this to the tree, but let's take a look at the other side first. So instead of using the taut line hitch and the overhand knot, you can see that there's just this little hook. It's actually a titanium hook. So we wrap it around the tree, put the line through the hook, and now we have what's called a continuous ridgeline, which means the line runs the whole way above the tarp. Now, you can put this under the tarp. We're going to get into the downsides of that in just a second here, but I like to run my line, my continuous ridgeline, above my tarp, and this is my setup of choice. So let's just talk about how to connect it to the tree. Over here, we can see that wasp right here. So to get the other side of the tarp to the tree, what we're going to do is we're going to take the line, wrap it around the tree, and then you can see this wasp, or hopefully you can see it right here. It has a little hook in its mouth. So we're going to run the line through that hook, tighten it down, and then run it over the head and then through its wing. Now the wing locks everything down, so it's not going to move anywhere. And that's just an easy way to hook up your tarp. The tarp is attached to the ridgeline via a Prusik knot, which we went over in the knot video. And with this, you can easily center it over your hammock. Now, the only downside about the Prusik knot attached to the ridgeline is sometimes you have to completely undo it and retie the Prusik knot, or else it ends up getting really, really hard to move. Now, I've experienced this myself, but just tying it again and again and again, you'll probably end up retying the Prusik knot about twice a year is what I've found. And it works out wonderful. So I'm able to center the tarp over the hammock and attach my tarp to the tree very, very quickly. So I highly, highly recommend, especially for beginner hammock campers, I really suggest that you at least get the continuous ridgeline or get 2 wasps, attach them to your tarp, and then connect each wasp with the line to the tree. That seems to be the easiest way. I really wouldn't tie a taut line hitch. I mean, I know how to do it. I've done it in the past, but once you go to this kind of system, you'll never go back, trust me. Something else I want to talk to you about is another piece of Dutchware gear. It's called a hookworm or a tarp worm. Now, you would use a hookworm if you want to take your lines off very easily and then hook them on whenever you want to set up camp. And you would use a tarp worm to actually just leave your line attached to your tarp. So whatever you want to do. I prefer just to be able to have the option to take them on and off of my tarp so the lines don't get all tangled. But this takes the place of the marlin spike hitch. Now, you can still use it, but this way you don't have to do the overhand knot as well. So you can see that the line is attached to this piece of shock cord. The shock cord is attached to the guy out point of the D-ring. So what we do with the hookworm or the tarp worm is we tension the line however we want, however tight you want, and you just wrap a loop around the bottom of that titanium hookworm or tarp worm, whatever you're using. Now that is going to keep the line from going anywhere, and then you don't have to tie the overhand knot or the marlin spike hitch. You can take your lines off. It's really simple. I really prefer this method as well. And when you're done, obviously you can see that I just pulled it out and then we can remove our line. So very simple process here. A lot of people use these, a ton of people use these, and I've never had one break. I've always just had good experiences with these. Dutchware definitely has some good products, so check out dutchwaregear.com. depending on the size of your hammock. So if you have a 10-foot hammock, I really recommend you get an 11-foot tarp. If you have an 11-foot hammock, I recommend going a foot bigger and getting a 12-foot tarp. The reason why I recommend that, and you can get a 10-foot tarp with a 10-foot hammock and you'll still be perfectly fine. However, if the rain decides to blow in on you, at least you have some extra coverage on the ends of the tarp. Another thing I do to get by the rain issue is I like to have my tarps with doors. Now I have a really in-depth video about my tarps, so we're not going to go into too many things, but I just have what's called a mitten hook, and I have pieces of shock cord attached to the D-rings for the doors. I hook them together when they're not being used. That way, if I need to deploy the doors, I can unhook this hook and bring it with the door down to this shock cord or my guy line, whatever I want to use here. That will basically stop any kind of rain that's getting inside your tarp. So it'll kind of seal you off in there and your lines can still run outside and attach to the tree. So if you're going to get a 10-foot tarp and you have a 10-foot hammock, I really highly suggest you go for the door option. I highly suggest you go for the door option no matter what kind of tarp you have. But if you get a large enough or a long enough tarp, I should say, then it really doesn't matter. It just depends on the type of rain that you're going to get. But I have found myself using the door option way more than leaving them back. It also adds a little bit of warmth, and it can help with condensation in the morning. So it kind of can block it out. You leave one door open and kind of the condensation just flows out. So it's a great idea, in my opinion, to get a tarp with doors. And if you're interested in seeing exactly how I set up my tarp, check right up here. I'll have a link to that video as well. So the last thing I want to talk about is your ridgeline of your tarp. Do you need a ridgeline? No, you don't need a ridgeline at all. If you're going to be using Prusik knots, then yes, I highly would recommend a ridgeline. But again, you don't really need to do that. If you just want to do a taut line hitch, or if you just want to get 2 wasps or fleas, or any number of Dutchware products will do this for you. There's a whole bunch out there, so check them out. You can just run your line to the tree. So what tarp do I recommend for a beginner hammock camper? I'd say go with either a sil poly or a sil nylon tarp, weighing your pros and cons of each. Remember, the sil poly doesn't sag when it's wet, but it also might tear a little easier whenever it's punctured. With a sil nylon tarp, it won't tear as easy, but it does sag when it's damp. So you constantly have to make adjustments whenever it's wet and lock everything down. Another thing you could do is, we talked about those hookworms. You could actually attach some shock cord, and a lot of people do this. They're called line tensioners, really. You attach the shock cord to the D-ring and then attach your line, your guy line, to that, and then run it down to the tent stake. So that would take care of any kind of sil nylon sagging issues for you, because that shock cord's always going to be tight. That's why it's shock cord. So anyway, guys, just want to say thank you for watching. I hope this video was informative, and I hope it helps somebody decide on what route to go with their tarp, what material to buy. And I hope I kind of broke some of the misconceptions about Dyneema composite fabric, Cuban fiber. So check the description box. Like I said, I'm going to leave a ton of links down there for specific things that I showed off, like the hookworms, the tarp worms, the continuous ridgeline, the materials, and different hammock tarp vendors that I highly recommend. I'm Frozen with Outdoor Adventures. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.